Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining our first community classroom event of the 2022-2023 academic year. We'll have three more. One will be November 16th. One will be in the spring. Well, actually, two in the spring. And those dates we will be sure to put on the website. Today, we are talking about climate justice from a global perspective. And we have our three esteemed guests here who I'll be introducing in just a moment. But first, I need to let you know that this has been put on in partnership between the Office of Student and Academic Affairs, WSU Tri-Cities Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and WSU Tri-Cities MOSAIC Center for Student Inclusion. My name is Jillian Cadwell. I'm a research associate at WSU Tri-Cities and team lead for the Department of Energy Inclusive Energy Innovation Prize. And I'm pleased to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you. First, I'll start off with our esteemed guest, Dr. Steve Gann. He's a climate scientist at PNNL. Was. Yes, okay, from 1990 to 2018. And a lab fellow since 2011. Following 5 years at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and receiving his bachelor's degree in atmospheric sciences from the University of Washington in 1979, and his doctorate in meteorology from MIT, shall we say, in 1988. He's internationally recognized for his expertise in representing aerosol particles and their effects on clouds and climate in global climate models. He has authored more than 180 publications in scientific journals, so I have some work to do. And is cited in the top 1% of all Earth scientists and served as an editor of the Journal of Geophysical Research, Atmospheres, from 2007 to 2016. He's was editor-in-chief from 2012 to 2016. And he's contributed to 3 climate change assessments by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which in 2018 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the assessments. He is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union. He leads the Tri-Cities Washington chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. And we're just so happy to have you here. Yeah. We also have Dr. Jonas Demisi. He's an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at Washington State University here. He has more than 15 years of experience in hydroclimatology, studying the causes and consequences of hydrological extremes such as floods and droughts. His current research focuses on improving the characterization and prediction of hydrological extremes and associated risks, updating engineering standards and designs to ensure sustainable and resilient infrastructure and water management programs. He served as a PI or principal investigator on multiple research projects focused on climate change and its link to floods and droughts. He's authored several articles and book chapters on these topics. Thank you for being here. And Dr. James Conca here on the end is a trustee of the Herbert M. Parker Foundation in the Tri-Cities. He's worked on nuclear and energy issues for 40 years at NASA, WSU, NMSU, Los Alamos National Laboratory, PNNL, get all the letters in there, and LLNL. He's been an advisor to the DOE, EPA, state and federal regulatory agencies, and industry. He worked on the Yucca Mountain project for 25 years and on the WIPP project for 10 years, and was a science contributor to Forbes on energy and nuclear issues for 10 years. He obtained a PhD in geochemistry from Caltech in 1985, an MS in planetary science in 1981, and a BSc in geology and biochemistry from Brown University in 1979. Thank you for being here, Jim.
You're welcome. We're the same academic age.
Boy, it's like I said, it just makes me think I got lots more work to do. All right, so what is climate justice, you ask? It involves the ways in which climate change can have differing social, economic, public health, and other impacts on underprivileged populations and communities. Can each of you please provide us with your perspective on climate change at a global level? And you can start in whatever order you like.
Will we go to slides?
Yeah. Shall we go
Well,
to
if you
slides?
don't mind, let me start because
Yeah.
I like the big picture, and then you all can focus in on various aspects. So if we could do, yeah, so energy justice. I kind of tend to approach environmental injustice from the standpoint of energy, since they're tied so closely. Let me just go to the next slide. So I love these NASA nighttime shots because you can tell right away who has energy and who doesn't. And that's what the fighting's all about, what's always been about, what will always be about. Now this is about 10 years old, so China's a lot brighter. We're a little bit brighter. But right now, we generate 24 trillion kilowatt hours a year. And I'd like, remember that number if you can. Also, I use kilowatt hours whenever possible because that's what you pay for. That's what comes in the energy bill at the end of the month. In Washington State, we pay about 8 cents a kilowatt hour, which is one of the cheapest in the world. And it's also one of the least carbon intensive. So we're in great shape, actually, in Washington State. But we are going worldwide to 35 trillion plus, depending on how equitable we are. And since we tend not to be that equitable, globally, we'll probably go to a lot more than that by 2040. So we need a lot more energy, and I'll talk about why. This is the breakdown by type. So the world is 2/3 fossil fuel and 1/3 split almost equally between hydro and nuclear. It's been that way for 40 years. It will be that way for the next 40 unless we make some radical changes. I won't talk about transportation much, but it's dominated by petroleum, and the only way really to change that is through fully electric vehicles. So this is a major push. But of course, you have to fuel those with electricity, so they're coupled in that sense. Now, the United States is 2/3 fossil fuel, still a little less coal now, a little more gas. Wind's coming up. Hydro's always been 6 or 7%, but it really depends on where you live. Washington State, like I'm talking about, is the least carbon intensive per person per year. West Virginia is mostly coal. Illinois is the most nuclear. Now, European Union's a little more nuclear because of France, a little less hydro. Korea is about almost 1/3 nuclear. They are planning to go to 60% nuclear, or they were planning to go there, just like Japan was before Fukushima, because they have no resources to speak of. They have no fossil fuel. Their wind resources are crap. Their solar resources are crap. Their bio resources are not very good. So if you want to be dependent, or if you don't want to be dependent on China, America, Russia, and everyone else for your energy, you go nuclear. That's what you do. Now, China doesn't look like much. They're still mainly coal and hydro, but they are building a new nuclear power plant every month. They're connecting to the grid, a new power plant every month. They just fired up 2 pebble bed reactors. That was our technology. And they just connected them to the grid. They're building their first SMR, and they just built a high temperature reactor as well, a fast reactor. So they make these 5-year plans, and they tend to stick to them. So the last 5-year plan says by 2035, they will have 180 new nuclear reactors. That is a lot. I mean, we only have 93 now. We used to have 105, 106. But so yeah, so they will be dragging everyone kicking and screaming into the new nuclear age and showing how it can be done quickly, cheaply, if you get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy. Of course, authoritarian governments tend to do that kind of thing, and they have their own issues that pop up as well. Next slide. So this is the world power consumption growth curve. It's very steep. It has nothing to do with us. We were last century. We're not this century. We're kind of stable. The world is presently at 24 trillion, like I mentioned. Next slide. 2/3 of that is fossil fuel. And you might say, well, okay, we're heading up. Are we going to continue to head up and up and up? Are we going to turn over in mid-30s, 30 trillion kilowatt hours per year? That would be nice, not to keep going. Next slide. But in order to address any of the environmental issues we're going to talk about, or we usually talk about, especially climate change, we're going to have to come up with 20 trillion kilowatt hours of non-fossil fuel. That's almost as much, I mean, that's more than we produce now with fossil fuel, just to keep fossil fuel where it is, not to roll it back. So these are big numbers. You got to remember these numbers because they are not trivial. And if you don't keep them in mind, then you will basically fall short. Next slide. Now, why that curve is so steep is because of these people. 1.2 billion people still have no access to electricity whatsoever, 80% of them in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where those areas were dark in the original NASA slide. 2.4 billion people still burn wood manure as their main source of energy, and 3 billion more people will be born by mid-century. That is a lot of people. And you might say, hey, well, forget about it. We have our energy, just keep them down. You know, that's kind of nasty. Next slide. Because it takes about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to lift someone up out of poverty. It's been that way for the last 10,000 years, okay, when our energy was not chemical or anything else, it was muscular. And so, now this is, keep this number in mind too, 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to lift someone up out of poverty. Next slide. So, what Glasgow, COP26 was about, and what all the climate meetings are about, how to give these people 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year without giving them coal, and who's going to pay for it? That's it. I mean, really, that is the most important thing. Everything else is secondary or details, that kind of thing. But what are we going to give them, and who's going to pay for it? This is the only way to eradicate global poverty. Next slide. That's because of this concept called the Human Development Index. I encourage you to visit United Nations HDI. This has been known for a long time. So what HDI is it goes from 0 to 10. I'm sorry, 0 to 1. 1 is perfect happiness, and 0 is perfect horribleness. And it's a function of electricity use, and that's it. It really is the first and main term in the equation of happiness. Access to energy. It doesn't matter whether you're a 17th century nobleman who's getting the equivalent of 3,100 kilowatt hours per year off the backs of 10 slaves, 10 indentured servants, 4 oxen, and 4 horses. It's a great calculation for the student. Or, of course, they weren't getting anything. He was getting it. Or everyone here that's getting about 12,000 kilowatt hours per person per year off the back of hydro, nuclear, a little bit of other. So it doesn't matter. You need 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to have what we consider a good life. And a lot happens when you get that. Your entire concept of the future changes. Your society changes. You suddenly think or believe that you will live to be age 40 and that your children will live to be age 40. That is huge, huge changes. And so every country that has gotten an average of above 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year that you can see up there, the birth rates dropped, plummeted to less than 2. Access to energy is the best birth control method in the world, in history, always has been. That's why the aristocracy has always died out. So this is not, access to energy is key to everything. It's key to climate change justice. It's key to just an environmental justice, period. How you give everyone this energy, though, is key. So if you look at the bottom part of that graph, where everyone is less than 2,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, they're all below 0.8. And everyone that we consider the developed world, the industrialized world, or whatever, first world in the old days, is above 0.9. And it is no wonder that you want to get into that group. Okay, whether you're fleeing a country or with your entire country yourself, you want to get into that group because that's where you have the most likelihood of having a good life. Now, you don't always have it. Lots of people in those countries don't have it, but you have a higher likelihood than you do in the other group. So when we talk about energy, we talk about the developed world bringing us down, right? Compact fluorescence, EVs, efficiency, all that kind of thing. But those other people don't have energy to begin with, to conserve. They don't have any energy. They don't have lamps to put compact fluorescence into. I mean, so it's a completely different strategy. And if you don't have a completely different strategy for these two groups, you will fail, and that's why we keep failing. Now, the second term in this equation of happiness is form of government. So as you see, Russia, Iran, and China are off the graph there because they are basically authoritarian governments, and they don't distribute their energy well. So they have a lot of energy. They should be up 0.9 or above, but they're not because of the form of government. But that is actually secondary to just access to energy. Now, China is kind of bizarre. It's 2 points. Next slide. China has 600 million still in abject poverty and 800 million in the middle class. Now, since your economic and military power derive directly from the absolute magnitude of middle class in your society, not the percentage, but the actual number of middle class, is there any question who's going to dominate the second half of the 21st century? Any questions on that? Okay. Actually, answers to most of my questions will be either China or $1 trillion. So, that's what's going to laugh. So anyway, so if you look at Chinese, their policies, whether it's economic, military, political, it's to get those 600 million into the middle class so that by mid-century, they will have 1 billion or more middle class. And the economic and military power derived from that will be enormous. Now again, authoritarian government, they tend to make stupid mistakes because they don't have much checks and balances, but it's likely that will happen. Next slide. Now there is a sweet spot here. If you get everyone up to about 4,000, get everyone down to about 4,000 to 6,000, that is a sustainable and ethical region to have the world into. And that is pretty much the only way to get rid of global poverty. That's it. I hate to say that. Now, Japan has been screaming down since 1990. They were at 16,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And they've been screaming down it mainly as a result of technology and low population growth, or zero population growth. I put California there as its own country because it's kind of funny. But California is relatively warm. Canada's up there. It will not move. It's big and cold. But there's not that many people there, so it's not going to affect global issues like the United States, China, or India. So again, keep this in mind, because there's always been a dynamic tension between the environment and humans, of course, right? So humans will always choose humans. I mean, we have the luxury to think about this now, but in general, if you ask someone if they want to keep their family alive or keep the spotted owl alive, they're going to choose their family. I mean, just all there is to it. So you have to understand that. You have to work with that. We have the luxury to make certain decisions, and that's great, but most of the world does not. They do not have the luxury to make those kind of distinctions. Next slide. So how much energy do we need to eradicate global poverty and its evil stepchildren, war and terrorism? Okay, the industrialized world cut us down to 6,000, kicking and screaming. We don't like to give up anything, but we don't need to be at 12 to 16,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. 6,000, the UK is at 6,000, shown that very nicely you can do this. But there's only 1 billion people in that subgroup. Let's see, there's a bunch at 3,000. Okay, keep them there. Developing world, you need to get up to 3,000, and those born coming out by 2050, you need to get up to 3,000. So we're talking about at least 34, 35 trillion kilowatt hours if it's distributed equitably. If it's not, then you're talking about 40 to 45 trillion kilowatt hours. So those are the numbers. That's it. Can't do it any other way. These are just big numbers. You're going to keep in mind. If you don't, you will fail. Next slide. Now, I don't know if I need to go over this since Steve is the real expert here, but as a geologist, this is global warming for the last 550 million years. Okay, now I apologize, it's a busy slide, so time is compressed in different regions. Over here on the right, it's thousands of years, then hundreds of thousands and millions, tens of millions and hundreds of millions. So what should jump out at you right now? Well, usually I ask to raise your hand, but that's okay. What should jump out at you is that we're cold. We have been in a cold spell for 10 million years, so much so that for the last 2.3 million years, we've had glaciation, and that is a rare event on Earth to have this much glaciation. So, cold. Now, the other thing, so people say, well, it's been warmer in the past. Who cares? There's been a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere in the past. Who cares? Well, actually if biota care, because if you change too rapidly, things don't go well. I mean, I don't like change. My cats don't like change. Biota doesn't like change. You change too fast, you die. It's called extinction. No big deal unless you're the one being extincted. So what's been happening here lately is that we have been getting warm very fast. In fact, because of the compression of these timescales, if you look at the last, 150 years over the same timescale, the same compression as the distant past, that'd be a vertical line. We're just, boom, we're just coming out of it vertically so fast that nothing has a chance to adapt. And that's the biggest problem. If you can't adapt, you have a real big problem. Next slide. So if you look at different climate models, and the ones in the literature, A2 or B1, sorry, I hate to get this weird about it, but pretty much if you do no reductions, business as usual, it gets hot. Okay? Now that's in Fahrenheit. If you do significant reductions, pretty much what everyone is thinking about, it's the B1. Well, it's not perfect, it doesn't get you back to 1850. Okay, you need other things to do that, but it's a lot better than A2. So pretty much when we talk about COP meetings and the negotiations and everything else about climate change, we're talking about who is going to pay for implementing B1. Next slide. Because our decisions actually matter. So here is, B1 or A2. So business as usual is A2, gets really hot everywhere. B1, a little bit better. Washington State does actually not so bad. We're slightly ameliorated by the marine climate on the west side, at least. But yeah, so we need to deal with this. This is not a trivial thing. Next slide. And things like crop yields, protein changes, they change with peak temperature during the growing season. So the yield goes down generally. And we just found that the protein content of rice goes down when the peak temperature during the growing season goes up. That's bad because that's a staple for billions of people. And if the protein content goes down, that's bad. That's where GMOs come in, and you can argue about GMOs, whatever. But again, this is you have to deal with it. You just can't let things go and then hope things get better. Now, wait. I'm sorry. Go back a little bit. Apples and cherries. Whoops. Sorry. Apples and cherries do badly in any future scenario, which is bad for Washington State because we are the biggest apple and cherry exporter in the world. Okay, but grapes and dryland wheat do quite well. So the wine industry is just fine. Don't worry. Next slide. So this is the last climate slide. This was modeling by the IPCC, and it basically said, okay, in order to keep to B1, in order to keep the temperature changes to a minimum, you had to decarbonate. Okay, decarbonize. So your global emissions have to go down. And in 2011, they had to go down starting at about 4% a year, which is pretty large. Well, we blew that one. So 2015 comes around, we have to now decrease 5% a year, which is pretty hard. I'll do that one. So 2020 comes around, and I used to talk about that in the future, which is really annoying. Now we have to go down 9% and go to 0 by 2040. That's why everyone talks about 2040 as being this tipping point. Well, yeah, because this gets steeper and steeper, so it's at some point you can't do it, and that's the big problem. So, big question is, how much have we decarbonized globally? How much have our emissions gone down globally? That's a trick question. Next slide. Next slide. No, we haven't gone down at all. So most projections show we will not start going down till about 2040, 2050. So that's a little late. A little late, don't like that. Not good, wrong direction. Next slide. So what are the fastest growing energy sources in the world? And usually shout out. Here, right here, shout out. What's the fastest growing energy sources in the world? Come on. I wish, go ahead. What? No.
Absolute or percent?
Actually, absolute. Yeah, which, next slide. Yeah, and that natural gas was that close. It is oil. And then followed by coal, and then followed by natural gas, and then followed by renewables. So in terms of absolute amount, fossil fuels together are growing faster than anything else. And that's because of those people in that curve that just need energy.
So Jim, do we just cry and go home now?
Yeah, yes. No. We're good. Humans are innovative. When
We're innovative.
when we exhaust all the stupid, solutions, we go with the good ones. So we're good. We will fix this. Next slide. So again, we got to get rid of those on the right side, and we got to bring up the ones on the left side. That's simple, but not easy. We don't have the luxury to pick and choose. You can't say, I don't like wind, I don't like nuclear. No, you
Right.
can't. You need them all. We don't have this luxury of picking and choosing our favorite energy source. We just need to get rid of all these that produce a lot of CO2 and bring the others up. That's it. And you need them all because not one is going to do it. There's no silver bullet here. Next slide. Now, nuclear recently, the UN Economic Commission for Europe lowered nuclear's emissions down to less than anything else. And they also came up with it has the lowest impacts on land occupation, carcinogenic effects. That's not intuitive, but it's true. It uses least amount of minerals and metals to produce a kilowatt hour, and it does not impact fresh water like almost all the others do. Next slide. So how do we achieve a low carbon future for Washington State? Next slide. We're already here. I mean, that's pretty low. But if we want to get to zero, this is kind of what we have to do. Now, speculation and everyone's favorite mix, whatever, something like that. It doesn't have to be that, but it has to be something like that. You need more nuclear, maybe double. You need more renewables, maybe double or triple. You need to keep hydro kind of steady. It goes down a little bit, but you got to get rid of coal and gas. That's it. And biomass isn't as good as you think. It does produce a fair amount of CO2, depending on how you do it.
Is that with more total production?
Yes, I'm sorry, next slide. I blew it. Okay, so generation in 2022 is going to be about 92 terawatt hours, and in 2035 will be up to about 115, and that includes, at least over 1 million EVs, but we really need to get to 3, 4, or 5 million, and that's going to need another 4 terawatt hours on its own, if not more. So if you actually replace all of internal combustion engines with EV, that's going to quintuple there. But still, you'll actually, with that much renewables, you're going to have grid scale storage. You're going to have pumped hydro. We keep shooting down pumped hydro, but it is the best storage there is. And there's also a new one called the energy vault. I don't know if you've heard of that. Instead of pumping water up to a height and then releasing it to generate electricity, you lift 30-ton blocks up and then release them to generate electricity. So you use renewables when they're available to lift something uphill, so you make gravitational potential energy out of it, and then when you need it, you let it. That's the only way to make renewables efficient enough to be useful, because right now, in Washington State, renewables, wind, only displaces hydro. It does not displace coal or gas. So it only displaces hydro, and that's you just dump it. So you're just wasting. So you have a renewable replacing another renewable, not the strategy you want. You want renewables to replace coal and gas. So you need to store it in order to use it at the time it's going to replace coal or gas. Next slide, that should be the end of it. Okay, well, this mix will cost Washington State about $200 billion, of which $100 billion is capital. Next slide. That's it. Thanks.
Well, and my understanding is that Washington will no longer have its coal plant running and it's being decommissioned.
That's another story. Yep.
Yeah. They're talking about the next few years.
Actually, I hope they do not dismantle it.
Right, just in case.
Right.
Well, then they're talking about what to do with natural gas as the one that is buffering the system.
Well, the CETA, the CETA legislation of 2019 basically gets rid of gas by 2030.
Right.
So again, this is the one of those things where you have to plan this correctly, or you're going to cause problems. So right now, the Northwest Power Pool predicts a 26% chance of rolling blackouts beginning in 2026, because not just our coal plant, but Oregon, Montana, Idaho, and Utah are closing all their coal plants and expecting to buy our hydro. And so wait a second, we're not going to have extra hydro anymore when we close our coal plants and our gas plants. So what are you going to do? Well, go to BC. Well, we're all going to be going to BC to try to get hydro from BC. At the same time, California is going to be trying to get energy because, so this is a mess. If you don't replace coal correctly, all you do is cause rolling blackouts. And that's a problem. That's what
Not good.
Texas has recently experienced.
Mhm. Well, thanks, Jim. I want to repeat the question for Jonas and Steve. Can you please provide us with your perspective on climate justice at a global level?
Okay, pull mine up. We're good here. All right, I think I'm going to stand over here so I can actually see the screen. Okay, I can do that. Yeah, so I've not given this talk before, so I'm pretty much going to read it if you don't mind. Next, and we'll go to the next slide. That's sort of an illustration of climate justice. I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, so next month, the 27th UN Climate Change Conference of Parties will meet in Egypt to discuss the next steps in the global effort to reduce the emissions driving climate change. They're meeting in Egypt to emphasize the impacts of climate change on developing nations, who are responsible for just a small fraction of global emissions, but are suffering impacts nonetheless. Reparation payments are being called for. We'll go to the next slide. So last week, the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change demanded more climate finance from the wealthier developed nations to help them build resilience to the impacts of climate change. The next slide shows those 20 vulnerable countries. They share two things in common: poverty and climate risk. In 2009, the developed nations pledged to provide $100 billion per year by 2020 to the developing nations. The contributions fell short of that goal, and much of the aid was from private sources, loans, and support for high-efficiency coal plants. Not exactly what they had in mind. So, two questions. Next slide. Why haven't those nations met their commitments, and what can be done about it? That's what I'm going to address today. Next slide. The fundamental problem is that the polluter pays principle has not been adequately established in the international community. Next slide. Climate change is a market failure. While fossil fuels have lifted billions out of poverty, the cost of fossil fuels do not account for their impacts on human health and the stability of the climate to which our civilization is adapted. Fossil fuel consumers are not paying for those impacts. Next slide. Fossil fuel use and climate impacts are not distributed evenly across the population. According to Oxfam, the richest 10% in the world emit 50% of the emissions. Next slide. The disparity is even greater in the US, where the richest 10% emit 5 times the emissions of the poorest 50%. The countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change are responsible for a negligible fraction of global emissions. Next slide. The inequality also holds in health and climate impacts. Globally, 20% of deaths are due to combustion of fossil fuels. In the US, 13% are attributable to pollution from fossil fuels, and poor Americans are exposed to 40% more particulates than average. Climate impacts also occur in local events such as wildfires, windstorms, and floods, acutely impacting those who happen to live in the path of these devastating events. Next slide. I did that one. Go ahead to the next one. So we can do better. While it can be argued that the economic benefits of fossil fuels have exceeded their adverse impacts, we can, indeed, must do better. We now have economically competitive alternatives to fossil fuels for energy production, which account for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. By replacing fossil fuels with carbon-free energy and hydrogen sources such as wind, solar, nuclear, hydro, and geothermal, and powering transportation with electricity and hydrogen, we can avoid the adverse impacts of fossil fuels without harming the pocketbooks of families or the economies of nations. Next slide. To correct the market failure, the price of fossil fuel must include the cost of impacts in proportion to the carbon emitted. This cost is called the social cost of carbon because it is presently carried by society at large. It can be estimated from calculations of the cost of future economic damage divided by the accumulated global emissions of carbon dioxide. A steadily increasing national price on carbon sends a market signal that drives decisions by utilities, manufacturers, and consumers to choose carbon-free products when deciding how to produce electricity and which products to make and purchase. Those decisions will decrease carbon emissions. Next slide. However, establishing a substantial price on carbon has been challenging. The U.S. Congress has tried and failed to do so. Some European countries have carbon pricing, but the price is quite low. Only Canada is on the path to a carbon price exceeding $100 per ton of carbon dioxide, equivalent to about $1 per gallon of gasoline. Next slide. So, how can carbon pricing be made more politically palatable? To some extent, direct climate impacts are mitigated by federal disaster relief and by insurance. But such relief is paid for by taxes and insurance premiums. That spreads the impacts throughout the population. So everyone pays for impacts in some way. The substantial revenue from a price on carbon can be used for many purposes. A simple and fair use is to give everyone an equal share of all the net revenue, each and every month. That wouldn't fully compensate victims of direct impacts, but it would provide a simple way to compensate everyone for the taxes and insurance premiums they pay to provide disaster relief for those victims. Next slide. Such carbon dividends would exceed or equal how much 99% of the poorest quintile of U.S. families would pay in carbon fees on the fossil fuel they use. Over 85% of people would break even or get more in carbon dividends than they'd pay in carbon fees. Carbon dividends would thus render politically viable a carbon tax that is consistent with the social cost of carbon and would also provide climate justice for victims and taxpayers. Next slide. A carbon price that increases by $10 per ton of carbon dioxide every year. For that carbon price, carbon emissions in the U.S. are estimated to decline by 50% in 20 years. Next slide. That will prevent hundreds of thousands of premature deaths over the next 20 years, as well as reduce future climate change. Next slide. So, such a carbon fee and dividend policy will address climate injustice at the national level in a simple way. But climate justice also involves intergenerational inequity. A carbon dividend based on current emissions does not compensate future victims of current emissions. The benefit of a price on carbon to future victims is primarily by driving down the emissions that are causing increasing damage to future generations. Compensating future victims from past emissions would require payments into a climate trust fund for future generations, and that would be much more difficult to establish. Next slide. The climate finance demanded by vulnerable nations is based more on past than present emissions. After establishing the polluter pays principle for present emissions with carbon pricing in the U.S. could call for its application to past emissions. Each nation contributes to international climate finance according to its past emissions and the social cost of carbon. Contributions could be spread over the next 30 years when global emissions are expected to have declined substantially. Or climate finance could at least compensate developing nations for current emissions using realistic estimates of the social cost of carbon. Next slide. But why would other countries agree to fund climate finance? Compliance can be incentivized by establishing a climate club of countries who pay into the Climate Finance Fund. Nobel laureate William Nordhaus proposed a climate club of countries with a global price on carbon. Such a concept could also be applied to a climate finance club. Those non-compliant countries outside the club must pay tariffs on goods exported to countries within the club. If countries are to avoid the carbon tariff, they must pay into the Climate Finance Fund. So that's sort of my vision of how we can do this. Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. I have to give a little shout out to Jonas because 8 years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, when we first met, I was very intrigued by the work you're doing. And I thought of it immediately when I was putting together this event. And I remember it moving me so much because, number one, I'm a civil engineer and water resources is my jam. But I mean, the work you've been doing all these years is it really makes a big difference in how we understand the power of water in this equation.
Yeah, I come from Ethiopia, so which is a gold. I mean, it's a key for all aspects of our life, and it's one of the reasons I chose a path to study water. Yeah, it's good thing to study about. Steve and James, but I'll try my best. So I will talk about the climate change impact and this inequality. The next page. So for me, there is nothing global, or when I say global, uniform about climate change, and there is nothing fair about climate change. If you look into how the world is warming, obviously it's not a uniform warming we are having. Some countries are suffering significantly, the others are not yet. If you look into the coast, there is nothing equal and fair in terms of the climate change. And then if you look at the impact by those change, there is nothing global or equal in those. And then we try to adapt some communities and countries, so there is no fair or equality in those mitigation technique. So I will say a strong sentence, but I will try to back it up with some rationales. This sentence is not it's just out of honesty. It's not out of anger or whatever. So for most, it is like also the way I see climate changes. For the most, it's like serving a life sentence for the crimes they haven't committed. And for some, it is even a death sentence. So imagine people living in Africa. They have nothing to do with the way the climate is now. But people are dying because of that, and people are suffering their livelihood. So it's a very important issue, and at the same time, it's a very sensitive one. So I will see what does climate justice means. I think once I give you that perspective. So next. I'm looking to the source. So as James says and Steve follows, I mean, we know the climate change, so we know there are a few handful of countries who are responsible for the emission, but the majority of the countries are paying the high price for those for other people's mistakes or for those decisions. And as you see, a handful of countries, I can give numbers there, like 70% of the global population live in Africa, only 4% greenhouse emission come from there. But the richest country, about 16%, pretty much equal to the African continent, are living, but about 40% of greenhouse emission come from those regions. So there is this big inequality in terms of who is causing the crisis. Next page. And then if you look into the impact, for example, the Paris Agreement is targeting to reduce or to hold the increase, the global temperature increase to about 2%. But that means it's about like 3.6%, 3.6 degrees centigrade for Africa. So still it's a significant increase in temperature, which will make places inhabitable if temperature increases at that level. So our globe is not actually warming equally, and there is some inequalities in how we target some of our policies. Next. Another visible impact of climate change is extreme precipitation. I try to highlight two regions where you see a big difference in terms of the change in extreme precipitation, in terms of frequency of a storm, the magnitude of a storm. If the western world relatively smaller compared to if you look into the southern hemisphere, look into South Africa, Africa, and South Asia, we see significant increases in extreme precipitations. So the impact is not uniformly distributed. Again, some areas will pay higher cost compared to others. Next. Another is sea level. We tend to estimate the average global sea level rise is about 3 to 4 millimeter each year globally. But if you zoom into Eastern Africa and South Asia, where there is a significant population, the increase in sea level could be about 5 millimeters. So which is again above the global average. Next. And then if you look into the impact on food productions and water availability, again, those countries which heavily relies on natural climate to grow will be impacted significantly. A country which doesn't have a resource to build a good irrigation system or a good agricultural mechanism will suffer because of the change in climate. So Africa, again, South Asia will pay higher cost in terms of food production. And then if you look into water stress, again, this country will suffer significantly because of, again, the climate change. Again, there is nothing equal in terms of the impacts. Next. It's vibrating. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then if you look into the vulnerabilities, again, vulnerability depends on lack and access to resource. There are structural inequalities or existing inequalities, and heavily relies on some regions, heavily relies on climate, natural climate, and some of those regions also are excluded from policy making or planning processes. So because of those existing inequalities, some regions tend to be more vulnerable than others. So when it comes to, again, climate change, vulnerability are not uniform. So there is significant variation going from region to regions or countries to countries. Next. And then when you come to mitigations, again, there is no equal, or mitigation cannot apply equally to all regions. One example is take biofuel. Biofuel is considered to be one fuel source which have less greenhouse emissions. But when it comes to food price, so it will have a significant impact to our basic food price, and that price may affect other countries globally, which is a very concerning trend. Land use change to grow biofuel, so some marginal land which is supposed to be left, or some forest land might be used to grow biofuel crops, and that will again reverse back whatever gain we gain from biofuel. Or there is also considerable water demand to grow some of the biofuel crops. that could impact a lot of regions.
When
So
I think,
biofuel could be a solution for some region, but again, at a global scale, it could be a very problematic approach to address. Yes.
well, I appreciate that you say, some of the folks that are most impacted, most severely impacted, are not at the table
Yeah,
helping
so they are
with
excluded
policy.
from planning process, policy process. I will come to that, I think, at the final recommendation. What should be the best practice? Really, if we are genuine enough, we need to widen up our
Well, I was going to
lens.
say, if you don't mind, so that we have a few minutes for questions, if you
So-
wouldn't mind, I'd like to start with you. Tell us what you think are opportunities for a stronger unity in protecting these global communities.
Yeah, so the way I see it is there are multiple, the short answer should be, I mean, you go to the cause, right? You need to name names. So responsible country need to be accountable. If the one who did a crime is roaming in the city and try to reduce a crime may not be a good approach. The first approach should be apprehend whatever is, I mean, make people responsible. But in a more bigger context, currently there are, I think, global initiative like the Kyoto, the Paris Agreement. There are a lot of good initiatives with intent. They have their own issue. They don't have this implementation mechanism. There is no enforcing mechanism, even if there is a good agreement among countries. And shamefully, I mean, as being a US didn't sign the Kyoto, so there need to be a commitment, especially countries with resource, financial and technological ability to really commit, one, open up your lens, increase your lens and try to see the problem from other perspective. This is not a national issue. Climate change is not a national issue. Climate change is a global issue. US cannot survive if the other nation is not surviving. So we need to widen up that lens, take accountability, and try to move. So there are a lot of global initiatives. There are a lot of regional initiatives like the European Climate Initiative. Countries come together, come up with a policy, come up with a goal in an equitable way, and then put the needed finance and the needed technology to help to achieve that aim. So the Kyoto have a certain target. A lot of people dispute what it achieved. Actually, didn't achieve much. One main reason is China and US didn't sign that agreement. So it's one of the two major contributors are not abided by that agreement. The Paris Agreement, it was a shame we get out of a Paris Agreement. It shows how the lack of commitment the country have for the international global community. So we need to really own them, lead as a US, we need to lead countries as a country with a big resource and capital and technology. We need to help. We need to see resilience in a global sense. I mean, the entire globe need to be resilient for us to sustain.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't finish, so if I quickly finish it, I have a last remark I would like
Sure.
to make.
And then for our folks on Zoom and in the audience, we'll have time for a few questions.
So if you move on to, so the next time I'm going to talk about is solar radiation. No, yeah, it's electric cars. It's a good technology as long as we're not leaving behind a significant portion of other countries, because you are widening up again the wealth gap is going to be a major issue. And another thing, coming from Africa, I really don't trust, like now the only thing the African will benefit from electric cars is, one, they need to improve their grid system. As Jim says, we don't have that electric grid system to support the electric car. That may invite foreigners to come to Africa, the Western, invest there. I'm not high expectation in that because we know what that means. So there is especially letting control an important economical system, transportation, to be owned by a foreigner. I don't think the African nation will be comfortable enough to do that, given the experience from 90s, 70s, 80s, and that kind of thing. So there will be a lot of pushback from Africa and want to accept electric car. And the other, I mean, I'm worrying it may create that again, the wealth gap, which come to that equity issue. The next one. The same with solar power. I mean, if you look into solar power in US, mostly you see it in a region where majority of them are white. But if you look into the Black community, Hispanic, even if the income level is the same on the x-axis, acceptance rate is not up to the white majority regions. And this also reflects in Africa. So solar power, again, this might widen up the wealth gap and associated to that other problems. So even if we address some issue, again, maybe creating another issue. I think I said this one already in terms of adaptability. Again, this relates to country resource, access to resource. So developing country are not adaptable compared to advanced country. So adaptability is not also uniform. So there is some inequalities in how countries will adapt to climate change. Next. Another is even response to the natural disaster. This is a study, I think it's a recent study which shows most regions impacted by natural disaster gain wealth, particularly if they are white dominant regions. Household on average, for example, in Seattle, gain over that certain period about 96,000, but minority region lost significant amount. So response, that might be insurance issue. Most of the people might be well insured. So if natural hazard hit you, you may be still okay, or you may be even doing better. But minorities, once you hit that with that disaster, you will have a negative, long-term negative on your wealth. So it shows throughout the country, you see that mismatch. So there is no equalities in how we respond to natural disasters. Next. And another is research gap. Again, most of the research are conducted in developed country. So we're missing, like those bars shows in Africa, there are few studies related to climate change impact compared to maybe North America. And that may lead to missing some indigenous knowledge, and even some of the issue may not be on the table. So issue might be driven by developing country issues. So African issue might not be the driving agendas and that kind of thing. So more study, or study is not equally distributed across the globe. One more study. Yeah. And then I'll say, so what does climate justice mean? Is honestly, we need to recognize and address these inequalities in the climate change, the cause, impact, the current mitigations, and then we need to emphasize on equities, not equality, to mitigate and adapt the climate change. Really, I think those are the two important things. The two important things come into mind when I hear about climate justice. So we need to understand. I mean, there is nothing equal when you talk about climate justice, and equity should be our guiding principle.
No, and it's interesting that you mention, lack of studying it. That's an interesting point, because if you're not able to study it, how do you prepare? Right? And that, in terms of equity,
and there are some issues which was not studied, but it's really important for that region, which is not in the policy. So if the policies mostly might be driven by developed countries' issues, than African issue or as developed countries issue. Yeah, so you need balanced study. Again, we need to widen up our heads. It's not about us. Us is a group. We are part of this big interconnected human nation. So we need to be able to look at that way. Mm-hmm. And there is a good way, and I don't know if it's appropriate forum to say it. In our culture, there is a saying, there was a big house fire, and there is a frog in a pond. And the frog says, wow, I'm lucky I'm in the water. so I don't feel the heat. And those poor people are burning in the house or burning in the house. And then at the end, people come and take that pond water and put it in the fire. So being not impacted by what happened around you doesn't mean that you are still secure. So I think it's a very telling story.
I will say I thought that the frog may be boiled.
At the end, she joins the party. So
Well, let's take a question. Do we have any on Zoom if we want to start with our friends there? No question. Any in the audience? Oh, let me bring you a mic. 1 second, sir.
I used to work for the Army Corps of Engineers at McNary Dam. And one of the things that we would do was send an awful lot of water downstream for fish passage, among other things. What possible solutions do we have to kind of address the environmental impacts, especially fish passage, in the context of kind of maximizing hydroelectric potential that we have?
That's a good point. We have strategies to help fish passage. I mean, not just the fish ladders, but we now have turbines that are pro-fish. But they have to be installed. Okay, we have them, but we're not installing them. We have cooling, water cooling because the water gets too hot when it's sitting behind the dam, and we even do trucking, fry up and down. So we need to do those. We need to do those at all dams. Right now, we have 11,000 dams in the state of Washington, and only 3% of them are powered, and only 1% of them have fish mitigation things. So they all have to have them. I mean, and also, like I mentioned, you could actually double hydroelectric in this country by not building a single new dam, just taking dams that exist that don't provide power and powering them. Okay, so you could double hydro. That's the lowest hanging fruit. But when you do that, you also have to put in fish passages. You have to put in the fish-friendly turbines and things like that. So you can do it. We're just not doing it. So I mean, again, most of the mitigation aspects of climate change we know how to do. We're just not doing it. Now, whether it's because it's costly or whether it's politically not good or whatever, that's the thing. So you have to structure it so it's cost effective, and you need to make it politically urgent.
From the panel. Any other questions around here? Okay.
Question on the concept of trying to collect revenue for carbon emissions. It sort of feels like we're in the fourth quarter on that, where we've burnt so much carbon for free for a generation or two that maybe a generation or two now will be paying for the impacts of that. And so I'd like to hear just maybe a little more about those thoughts that are on the table about reparations and what that looks like as far as catching up so that everyone can pay towards carbon emissions in the future.
Yeah, I really don't know what specifically they're calling for the COP27. They want more money. The $100 billion is not enough, and I don't know how they in the past it's been pledges, not based on any hard numbers on emissions. So I haven't seen any evidence that they're going to use something like I've described. It's really related to current emissions, let alone accumulated emissions. They're just trying to get what they can, and I'm offering an argument that could be put forward, but I think it would take time to implement, and that's a problem because they need the money now.
Here's one from Zoom. Carrington Moore says, it was mentioned that using biomass energy solutions increases the cost of those respective foods. Could you elaborate more on that?
Yes, so it's a well-known discussion regarding the competition between food versus fuel. So if most of the corn and soybean end up being used for producing biofuel, so that means they are all from our groceries stores and that kind of places. So that will basically it's going to drive the price up. Farmer will sell for a fuel production than than the food. So it's a basic economics. If the price is high for fuel, then I mean the food need to match that price. And I think that the data I showed is from the World Bank. The corn price went about 21%, and soybean is about 27% over the past 10 decades. And the driving force is demand for biofuel and energy.
Well, thank you, our esteemed panel for we have another one. Yeah, no, we're good. Here, I'm going to give you the mic.
From Raisin Osman, what can we do as individuals to push for global climate justice?
Repeat the question.
What can we do as individuals to push for global climate justice?
Vote for people who care about the climate. That's what we can do in the US. Can't really do much about China, right? I mean, that's out of our hands.
I think start from our individual activities, show our passion to what we believe. So at least understand that consequence. And then there is citizen-driven activities that we can participate in. Change legislations. I mean, that should be one of our top agenda when politicians. I think there are a lot of things individual can do, especially in this country. I think those are some of the things.
I volunteer with an organization that has been advocating this price on carbon and certainly the notion of polluter pays. And so I would urge people to get involved with that organization. It's called Citizens Climate Lobby. You can check it out at citizensclimatelobby.org and get involved with advocating, really exercising their citizenship in advocating for a price on carbon. That's really the first step, I think. And that includes the carbon dividend, which benefits the poor more than any other persons.
I'd be interested in hearing your opinions about the kind of perceived ease or lack thereof of the permitting process for building, especially new hydro, nuclear, kind of alternative energy sources, and how hard or easy that is relative to oil or coal or any other kind of petro.
It's incredibly hard. The hoops you have to jump through for nuclear and hydro are insane, and they're not driven by science or engineering. They're just, it's basically perception. So yeah, so that is the problem, because you've got coal and gas and you've got nuclear and hydro. Those are your choices. Because you need some backup power, you need some base load, you need firm power. You can't get away with just wind and solar. You just can't. It doesn't occur all the time, and especially doesn't occur when you need it the most. So when it's really hot and really cold, renewables do not produce. That's just the way it is. So you need something else. So you either have to choose between coal and gas, or, I mean, and nuclear and hydro as a group. And nuclear and hydro is so much more difficult to license and to approve than coal is not difficult, but gas is so easy. That's why state legislatures love gas. You can throw up a gas plant in a year. Gas is still relatively cheap. But, that's the problem. And so this last piece of legislation out of DC, the Inflation Reduction Act was trying to streamline the licensing for nuclear and hydro, and it got derailed. So it was not included. It needs to be included. Now, China, again, as I was mentioning, they can build a big nuclear power plant in 3 years on budget and hook it up to the grid, and they've been doing that. And they can even build the alternative reactors, the new ones, pebble bed reactors. They just fired up 2 of those and connected them to the grid. So, I mean, you can do it. You just have to stop this start and stop. The United States does this a lot. We have subcontractors, and something happens. You throw out that subcontract, you bring in a new subcontract, takes them a year to come up to speed. And, this just drags on. And anytime you're building something that costs $1 billion, like the Golden Gate Bridge, doesn't have to be a nuclear power plant, anything that costs $1 billion, you can't start and stop. You need to start it and finish it, because all of the costs are depending on continuous, construction. And so the price just goes up, the time goes up, and everyone gets upset because we start and stop. A lot of those are because of the ridiculous regulatory environment surrounding nuclear and hydro.
Again, I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to be here with us. And we just really appreciate you kicking off this event. Please stay tuned for our community classroom events to come. Again, November 16th is the plan for the second one, and we'll be looking at a local perspective. So we'll be having folks from around Tri-Cities area coming in to talk about climate and energy, and also access to our communities and inclusion of our communities, particularly those that are underserved in our area. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you hopefully on November 16th. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Julie.